a father's betrayal, a stranger's mercy, a woman who refused to stay broken. In a single afternoon, Eleanor Hayes lost everything she thought she had: her home, her name, and the last shred of belief that any man in her life would ever choose her over convenience. She stood in the middle of a dusty frontier street while her own father took money from a stranger's hand and walked away without looking back. The crowd laughed. The auctioneer moved on, and Eleanor stood there, 24 years old, with nowhere to go and no one left to call family. What happened next would change an entire valley forever. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel like you were worth less than you actually are, stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor's story can travel. The morning Eleanor Hayes rode into Mill Haven beside her father, she was thinking about flour. That was the honest truth of it. She was thinking about whether the general store would have the good kind, the kind that didn't leave grit in the biscuits, and whether she should ask her father for an extra dollar to buy the small jar of cinnamon she'd been stretching for 3 months. She was wearing her second-best dress because he'd told her they were going to town for supplies, and she hadn't wanted to ruin her only good one with wagon dust. She was not thinking about what her father had planned. She never was. Thomas Hayes had a face that people trusted instinctively, which was the greatest cruelty nature had ever played on the people around him. He was a tall man with honest eyes and calloused hands, the kind of man who looked like he'd built something with his life. He hadn't. He'd borrowed against it, mortgaged it, lost it in pieces over 15 years, and blamed everyone in his path for the losing. He'd blamed Eleanor's mother until she died. He'd blamed the weather, the cattle market, the neighbors. He'd blamed Eleanor for being born a girl, for being born large-framed and plain-faced and too smart for her own good, for costing him money instead of bringing it in. By the time she was 12, she understood that she was an expense to him. By the time she was 24, she understood that he was looking for a way to zero out the books. She just didn't know he'd already found one. The wagon rolled down Mill Haven's main street on a Thursday morning in late September of 1882, and Eleanor noticed right away that something was different. There were too many people out. For a Thursday, the boardwalks were crowded, men standing in clusters, women pretending to shop while their eyes tracked the road. A few heads turned when the Hayes wagon passed. Someone said something low, and the person next to them laughed. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter without quite knowing why. "Stay on the wagon," her father said, jumping down near the post office. "I'll only be a minute." She stayed. She watched him go inside, watched him come back out 3 minutes later with a piece of paper folded in his hand. He didn't look at her. He walked to the center of the street, unfolded the paper, and raised his hand. "Folks," Thomas Hayes said, in his big, carrying voice, the same voice he used when he preached at the church social, the same voice that made people nod and feel like they were hearing something reasonable. "I've got an offer here for anyone interested. My daughter Eleanor, 24 years old, strong worker, good with numbers, never been married, no known ailments. I'm looking for someone willing to take over her guardianship. Starting bid is $15. The words hit Eleanor like water thrown from a bucket. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands gripped the edge of the wagon seat, and she sat there in her second-best dress, in the middle of Mill Haven's main street, while her father auctioned her to strangers. There was a moment, just 1 second, where the crowd was quiet, shocked, maybe, or deciding whether to be shocked. And then someone laughed, and someone else joined in, and the thing became what public things always become when enough people decide to let it: entertainment. "She's a big one, Tom," a man called out from in front of the hardware store. "You sure $15 covers the feed bill?" More laughter. Eleanor felt her face go hot. She looked straight ahead at a point between the wagon horse's ears and breathed through her nose and did not cry. She would not cry. She had decided years ago that she would not cry in front of people who found her suffering funny, and she had not broken that rule yet, and she was not going to break it now. $20, someone said. "I'll do 25, said another voice, rougher, from somewhere behind her. She didn't turn to look. Her father was nodding like a man at a cattle auction, scanning the crowd with that practiced, reasonable expression. He caught her eye once, just once, and looked away. Nothing in his face said he was sorry. Nothing in his face said he felt anything at all. 30, said the rough voice again. Gentlemen, the auctioneer, who had apparently materialized from somewhere, because this had all been planned, called out, "We've got 30, Do I hear 35? Eleanor climbed down from the wagon. She didn't know why. There was nowhere to go. She had no money, no horse, no one in Millhaven she could call a friend, but sitting up on that seat felt like being displayed on a shelf, and she couldn't do it anymore. She stood beside the wagon wheel with her arms at her sides and stared at a spot on the ground and breathed. 35, said a new voice. She looked up. The man who'd just bid was standing near the edge of the crowd on the far side of the street. He was maybe 30, 32, wearing a plain work coat that had seen better years. Not tall, but solidly built, the kind of solid that comes from actual work rather than show. He had dark hair and a jaw that needed a better introduction to a razor, and he was watching her father with an expression Eleanor couldn't read. Not hungry, not amused. Something quieter than either of those things. 40, said the rough voice, and she finally turned to find the source. The man standing in front of the saloon was named Wade Cutler. She knew this because everyone in the county knew Wade Cutler, or knew of him. A land broker who smelled like he gargled with whiskey every morning and who had a reputation for three things: buying property cheap, running it into the ground, and treating the people on it like furniture. He was grinning at her with his hat pushed back on his head like this was the best Thursday he'd had in years. Eleanor felt sick. $40, the auctioneer called out. Do I hear 45? The man in the work coat looked at Cutler. Then he looked at Eleanor. Their eyes met for just a moment, not long enough for her to read anything into it, but long enough to notice that he wasn't laughing. $40, the auctioneer repeated. Going once? 40, said the man in the work coat. I'll match it. A ripple went through the crowd. Matched bids meant a decision, and the auctioneer looked at Thomas Hayes, who was already moving toward Cutler with his hand extended. But the man in the work coat stepped forward, and something in the way he moved made Thomas Hayes stop. Tom, the man said. His voice was quiet enough that Eleanor had to strain to hear it over the crowd noise. I've got $40, same as Wade, but I'd like you to consider which offer your daughter walks away from more safely. Wade Cutler's grin went sharp at the edges. You implying something, Mercer? I'm stating something, the man Mercer said. Plainly. Thomas Hayes looked at the $40 in his hand. He looked at Cutler. He looked briefly, and without visible guilt, at Eleanor. Mercer, he said, and held out his other hand. Eleanor watched her father take money from a stranger and put it in his coat pocket. Then Thomas Hayes climbed up on the wagon, flicked the reins, and drove away down Millhaven's main street without once looking back. She stood in the street for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 30 seconds. The crowd was dispersing. The entertainment was over. People drifted back to their errands, their conversations, their ordinary Thursday lives, and a few of them looked at Eleanor as they passed with expressions that sat somewhere between pity and satisfaction. The look people give when something unfortunate happens to someone they don't quite think deserves better. One woman she vaguely recognized from church meetings said, "Well," in a voice that managed to contain an entire judgment, and walked on. Mercer didn't approach her immediately. He waited until most of the crowd had filtered away, and then he crossed the street at a measured pace and stopped about 4 feet from her, which was farther away than most men would have thought necessary. He took off his hat. It was such a small thing, such a completely ordinary thing, the kind of thing a man did when he was talking to a woman he respected, and Eleanor had not had a man do it for her in so long that the gesture hit her somewhere unguarded, and she had to breathe carefully for a moment. Miss Hayes, he said, my name is Caleb Mercer. I have a ranch about 6 miles east of here. I know who you are, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. You just bought me. No, he said. I paid $40 to keep Wade Cutler from doing it. Those are different things. Eleanor looked at him. His eyes were a dark gray-brown, the color of creek water after a rainfall, and they were looking back at her without any of the calculation she was braced for. No assessment, no inventory, just a man looking at another person and deciding to treat her like one. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. She had been raised by Thomas Hayes, and Thomas Hayes had honest eyes too. So what happens now? She asked. That's up to you, Caleb Mercer said. I have a wagon around the corner. I'm heading back to the ranch before dark. You're welcome to come, and I'll give you a room and fair work if you want it. Or I can give you $20, half of what I paid, and you can make your own way from here. He paused. I'll tell you straight out, I'm not looking for a wife. and I didn't come to town today intending to end up in this situation. But I'm not going to leave you standing in the middle of Millhaven with nothing either." Eleanor looked at the empty space where the wagon had been. She looked down the street toward the train station. She had no ticket, no luggage, no money except what she'd put in her dress pocket this morning. 62 cents for the flour and the cinnamon she wasn't going to get now. "What kind of work?" she said. "Honest kind," he said. "Ranch runs on about 400 head right now. Got a good foreman and 4 hands. I keep books myself, but I'm better with cattle than numbers, and it shows. Kitchen needs managing, there's mending, and the garden's been let go since last spring." He stopped. "Nothing you'd be ashamed of doing." Eleanor thought about Wade Cutler's grin. "I'll come," she said, "but I want the room with a lock." Mercer nodded like that was the most reasonable request he'd ever heard. "I'll put one on tonight," he said. The wagon rolled east out of Millhaven as the afternoon light started its long lean toward the horizon, and Eleanor sat on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and watched the town shrink behind her and felt something cold and hollow settle into the middle of her chest. She had left with nothing. Not because she had nothing, she'd had small things, the things that accumulate over a life spent in one place: her mother's hairbrush, a box of letters, 3 books she'd read until the spines gave out. All of it was in the house that no longer had a place for her, with the man who had just sold whatever remained of his obligation to her for $40. $40. She kept coming back to the number. A good milk cow cost more than that. A decent saddle horse cost more than that. Her father had weighed everything she was against everything he needed and arrived at $40, and he hadn't even looked sorry. Caleb Mercer didn't try to make conversation, which she was grateful for. He drove with the easy, habitual looseness of someone who'd made this particular trip a few thousand times, and he let the silence sit without feeling the need to fill it. The horse, a thick-necked bay with a white blaze, moved steadily, and the road ran between dry grass fields that were starting to show the first yellow edges of fall. After about a mile, Eleanor said, "Why did you do it?" He didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be thinking about it honestly, rather than reaching for the convenient answer. "I've done business with Wade Cutler twice," he finally said. "Both times I came away feeling like I needed to wash my hands. I know what he does with people he thinks he owns." He paused. "I've got a younger sister. She's married now, lives in Colorado. But I thought about her." "I'm not your sister," Eleanor said, sharper than she intended. "No," he agreed. "You're not. And I'm not doing this because I think you need saving. I'm doing it because Cutler needed stopping, and I happen to be the one standing there." He glanced at her sideways. "You'd have done the same if you'd had the money." Eleanor thought about that. She thought with sudden ferocity that yes, she absolutely would have. "Has this kind of thing happened before?" she asked. "In Millhaven? Auctions like that?" "Not openly," he said. "Your father's the first man I've seen do it in the street." Something in his jaw tightened. "He's not going to be widely admired for it." "He doesn't care about being admired. He cares about being unencumbered." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and decided she was too tired to disguise it. "He's been waiting for an opportunity like this since my mother died. I cost him money, and I wasn't what he wanted, and now I'm someone else's problem." Mercer looked at her directly then, for just a moment, before his eyes went back to the road. "You're not a problem," he said. "You don't know that yet." "No," he said. "But I figure I'll find out." The Mercer Ranch came into view around a bend in the road as the last real light of the day was going amber-orange over the western hills. Eleanor's first impression was that it was bigger than she'd expected and less tidy than it needed to be. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from good timber that had weathered to a respectable gray. A wide porch ran across the front, and someone had once planted climbing roses along the left side. They were still there, leggy and wild, unpruned for what looked like several seasons. There was a large barn behind the house, and beyond that the faint outline of additional outbuildings. A bunkhouse sat about 30 yards east of the main structure, lit from within by lamplight. The whole property had the look of something well-built that had been running on momentum for the last few years. Solid bones, but missing the daily attention that keeps a place from slowly coming apart. A man came out of the barn as they pulled in. He was old, genuinely old, not just middle-aged, somewhere past 60, with the bowed legs of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. His face was a collection of lines and angles organized around a pair of sharp blue eyes that had clearly not gotten old along with the rest of him. "Silas," Caleb called, climbing down from the wagon. "This is Eleanor Hayes. She'll be staying on." Silas Boone stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Eleanor with those sharp eyes as she climbed down from the wagon, not with the assessing look the men in Millhaven had used, but with something more like the way you'd look at a new piece of equipment, trying to work out what it was meant to do. "How do?" he said. "How do?" Eleanor said back. "She any good?" he asked Caleb, still looking at her. "Don't know yet," Caleb said. "I can hear you," Eleanor said. Silas's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Good ears," he said. "That's a start." He turned back to Caleb. "Dinner's been sitting since 6. Boys are waiting." "We'll be right in," Caleb said. He looked at Eleanor. "You hungry?" She was. She hadn't eaten since early morning, and the hollow feeling in her chest had spread to include her stomach somewhere around mile 3 of the wagon ride. "Yes," she said. "Then come in and eat," he said simply, and walked up the porch steps. Eleanor stood for a moment in the yard with the wagon horse blowing softly beside her, and the lamplight from the bunkhouse laying yellow rectangles on the ground. Somewhere across the ranch a coyote called, and something else answered. The air smelled like dry grass and cattle, and the faint wood smoke sweetness of a cooking fire. It wasn't home. It wasn't anything yet. But it wasn't Millhaven, and it wasn't the terrifying alternative that Cutler's grin had represented, and for right now, on the worst day of her life, that was going to have to be enough. She walked up the porch steps and went inside. The kitchen was large and warm and smelled like beans and cornbread and the ghosts of previous meals baked into the walls. A rough table ran down the center of it with benches on both sides, and 4 ranch hands were sitting along those benches with the fidgety patience of men who'd been told to wait and didn't have much practice at it. They looked up when Eleanor came in. She was accustomed to being looked at, and not kindly, and she braced for the inventory, the up and down that cataloged her size and found it wanting. 2 of the men did exactly that, not with malice, but with the automatic reflex of people who'd never had to think about it. A 3rd man, very young, maybe 18, with a spray of freckles across his nose, looked at her with open curiosity. The 4th man was reading something and didn't look up at all. "Boys," Caleb said, going to the stove and lifting the lid on a pot. "This is Eleanor Hayes. She's going to be helping run the house and working the books. Treat her like you'd want your mother treated." He set the lid back down. "Or don't, and find another place to sleep." It wasn't said with heat. It was said the way you'd state the weather, and that made it more effective than if he'd thundered it. The young freckled one said, "Yes, sir." "I'm Danny," the freckled one added, apparently deciding that was his business. "Danny Pruitt. I've been here 8 months." He stuck out his hand. Eleanor shook it. His grip was uncertain, the grip of someone who'd been told to shake hands firmly but wasn't quite sure how. "Eleanor Hayes," she said. "We know," said one of the men who'd done the inventory, a compact, weathered man in his 30s with a sharp face. "Caleb told us you were coming." Something in his voice sat at a careful neutral that meant he was reserving judgment. "Holt," Caleb said without looking up from the stove. "Be decent." Holt said nothing, but he moved down the bench to make room. Eleanor sat and ate beans and cornbread and didn't taste much of it. She was running on some kind of fuel that sat below hunger and above despair, the kind of numb efficiency that kicks in when your body understands that your mind has taken too much for one day and is temporarily closed for renovations. Caleb showed her the room after dinner. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, small but clean, with a window that looked out toward the eastern pastures. There was a bed with a quilt that had seen better days but was solidly made, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. The floor was swept. Someone had put a candle on the windowsill. "No lock yet," Caleb said from the doorway. He didn't come into the room. "I'll fix that tomorrow morning. If it troubles you tonight, you can put the chest against the door." "It won't trouble me," she said, although she wasn't certain that was true. "There's a store in the chest. My mother left some things when she passed. Dresses, some other things. She was a bigger woman than most people around here knew what to do with, so they should fit all right. Help yourself to whatever's useful." He paused. "I know today was... I don't have a word for what today was. But you're safe here. That's what I can promise, and I don't say things I can't promise." Eleanor looked at the quilt on the bed. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, even though thanking this man felt strange and complicated, and she didn't entirely trust her own reasons for doing it. He nodded. "Breakfast is at 6, he said, and left. Eleanor stood in the room for a long time after his footsteps faded down the stairs. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, and the quilt was soft under her hands, and the window showed her a slice of dark sky with more stars than she'd ever seen from her father's house, and she sat there and was very, very quiet and did not cry. She had promised herself that, and she was not going to break it, but she sat there for a long time. The first week was the hardest, not because anyone was cruel to her. In fact, the absence of cruelty was itself disorienting, the way sudden silence after a long noise can make your ears ring. It was hard because Eleanor Hayes had spent 24 years learning to make herself small and invisible and unobtrusive, to take up less room than she actually occupied, to preemptively agree with things she didn't agree with and stay quiet during conversations she could have improved. She had learned this because being visible in her father's house meant being a target, and she had survived by being the kind of person no one thought about enough to direct their anger at. Now she was being asked to be visible, to run the kitchen, which required decisions, to manage the household accounts, which required assertions, to be present at meals and have opinions about what the men needed and didn't have. It went against every instinct she'd developed, and the effort of overriding those instincts left her exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work. The physical work, at least, she understood. She started with the kitchen because the kitchen was chaotic in the particular way of a place that had been run by well-meaning people with no system. There was food in the wrong places, equipment stored without logic, accounts kept in 3 different notebooks that didn't agree with each other. Eleanor spent her first 3 days establishing order, not imposing it dramatically, just quietly creating it, putting things where they made sense, writing down what was there and what was needed, identifying the waste that comes from disorganization. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas Boone came into the kitchen while she was making biscuits and watched her for a while in silence. "You don't measure," he observed. "I know the amounts," she said, without looking up. "My mother was like that," he said. "Best cook I ever knew." She glanced at him then. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, still watching her with those sharp eyes. "Something I can help you with, Mr. Boone?" she asked. "Silas," he said. "I've been Silas since before you were born, and I'm not starting to be Mr. anything now." He paused. "Caleb says you're going to look at the books." "That's my understanding, yes." "I've been telling him for 2 years there's something wrong with them," Silas said. His voice was carefully level in the way of someone who has been not listened to about something important. "Numbers don't add up. Money goes places I can't account for. He says it's just bad bookkeeping." Eleanor put down her biscuit, then turned to look at him fully. "And you don't think it's just bad bookkeeping?" "I think Caleb Mercer is one of the best ranchers in this county and one of the worst businessmen," Silas said, "and I think somebody knows that and has been making use of it." He paused. "I think it'd be useful to have someone look at those books who isn't afraid to say what they see." "When can I start?" she said. Something in Silas's face shifted, not quite to warmth, but to something adjacent to respect, the kind you give something that performs as expected. "Caleb keeps them in the study," he said. "I'll tell him you asked." The books were bad. Eleanor had expected bad, and they were worse than that. She spread them across the study table on a Saturday afternoon while the ranch was quiet, and she went through them the way her school teacher had once taught her to approach a difficult text. From the beginning, slowly, without assuming you understood what you were reading until you'd read it twice. The first thing she noticed was the inconsistency. Months where income was recorded in one notebook, but expenses in another, with nothing to reconcile them. Payments to suppliers that appeared twice, or appeared in amounts that didn't match the receipts filed loosely in an envelope at the back of the drawer. A pattern of small errors that might be carelessness, but might be something else. The second thing she noticed was a name. Blackwell Land and Cattle Company appeared in the books 18 times across the past 3 years, always as a creditor, always for amounts that were just slightly inconsistent with what she'd expect for the services described. A contract for water rights, a grazing agreement, a survey fee. None of the amounts were large enough to be alarming individually. All of them together made her sit back in her chair and look at the ceiling. She'd heard the name. Damien Blackwell was the kind of man whose name traveled through a region ahead of his arrival. The kind of man people mentioned with a certain careful neutrality when they didn't know who else in the room might be loyal to him. He owned land on the south side of the valley, had bought several smaller operations in the past 5 years. He was wealthy in the particular way of men who created wealth by moving it from other people's pockets into their own. And he had a reputation for finding the weakest point in a person's situation and pressing until something gave. Eleanor looked at the books again. She thought about what Silas had said. Somebody knows that and has been making use of it. She thought about how carefully the irregularities were distributed. Never enough in any single entry to scream, but consistent in a way that felt designed rather than accidental. Someone who understood accounting had done this. Someone who understood that a busy rancher who was better with cattle than numbers would review totals, not line items. She found Caleb at the barn at dusk, checking a fence line repair that Danny Pruitt had done that afternoon with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "I need to talk to you about the books." He studied her face for a moment. "How bad?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I think bad. And I think it may not be an accident." She paused. "I think you should hear what I've found before I go any further." He nodded, slowly, and handed the hammer to Danny Pruitt. "Fix that third post," he told him. "I'll be back." They walked back to the house side by side, and Eleanor thought about how strange it was. This thing she'd almost gotten used to. This being talked to like a person instead of an inconvenience. She wasn't used to it yet, not fully. Some part of her was still waiting for the catch. But she thought, as she walked through the last of the September evening toward the lit windows of a house that was beginning, tentatively, to feel like it might become something to her, she thought that maybe the absence of a catch was itself something worth paying attention to. In the study, she laid out everything she'd found for him. She showed him the discrepancies, the name that kept appearing, the pattern she'd identified in the irregularities. Caleb Mercer sat across the table from her and listened without interrupting, and she watched his face go through the quiet progression of a man realizing something has been happening right under him that he should have seen. "Blackwell," he said when she finished. "His company," she said. "Directly. I can't tell yet. The signature on these contracts isn't his, but the pattern has someone behind it who knows what they're doing." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at the books without seeing them, looking at something further away. "How much?" he said. "I can't give you a precise number until I've been through everything," she said. "But my estimate, preliminary, is somewhere between $800 and $1,200 over 3 years. He didn't flinch, which surprised her. He just nodded, slowly, like a man absorbing bad news he'd been half expecting. "What do you recommend?" he said. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the town she'd ridden away from, and the people in it, and the way power worked in places like this valley. How wealth insulated you from consequence. How having fewer resources than your enemy usually meant losing in a direct confrontation. "I recommend we don't confront anyone yet," she said. "I recommend we go through everything, every contract, every receipt, every entry, and we build a complete picture before anyone knows we're looking." She paused. "If Blackwell is behind this, he's smart. And smart people don't survive being challenged with incomplete evidence. They just reorganize the attack." Caleb looked at her for a moment. A different kind of looking than she was used to, evaluating not her appearance, but her judgment. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" "Time," she said, "and copies of everything you signed." He stood up and went to the cabinet in the corner of the room and opened it. Inside, Eleanor could see a stack of folded documents. He took them out and set them on the table. "Every contract I signed in the last 4 years," he said. "I kept copies even when I didn't understand why." She looked at the stack. Then she looked at him. "That was smart," she said. Something in the corner of his mouth moved. "Don't sound so surprised," he said. She almost smiled. Almost. "I'll start in the morning," she said. She started that night. She worked by candlelight at the study table while the house settled around her. The old wood contracting in the cooling air. The wind coming in from the north and pressing against the windows. The documents spread across the table in the growing order she was building out of their chaos, and Eleanor lost herself in the work the way she always had, the world narrowing to the thing directly in front of her, the particular satisfaction of making sense out of confusion. She had always been like this. Since childhood, numbers had made more sense to her than people. They didn't change their story depending on who was listening. They didn't tell you what you wanted to hear. They just were what they were. And if you read them carefully enough, they told you the truth. By midnight, she had confirmed the pattern she'd suspected. By 1 in the morning, she had identified a third layer she hadn't seen before. A secondary contract, buried under a water rights agreement, that gave Blackwell land and cattle a first claim option on the Mercer property in the event of foreclosure. She sat back and stared at it. Not just bleeding the ranch dry then. That was only the mechanism. The goal was the land itself. She thought about the valley she'd driven through on the way here. The way the Mercer property sat at the geographic center of it, controlling access to 2 creek systems, the best grazing land in the county. She thought about what that land would be worth to someone who wanted to dominate the region's water and cattle markets. She thought about Damian Blackwell, whom she'd never met, sitting somewhere comfortable and patient, waiting for this ranch to collapse under the weight of debts he'd manufactured. The hollow feeling in her chest shifted into something harder and less comfortable and considerably more useful. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Caleb found her there when he came downstairs at 5:30 to start the coffee. He stopped in the study doorway and looked at the documents spread across the table, and at Eleanor sitting in the middle of them with ink on her fingers and her hair coming down from the pins she'd put it up in the night before. "You stayed up," he said. "I found something you need to see." She organized the documents into a more navigable stack. "But drink your coffee first. What I'm about to tell you is the kind of thing you want to be awake for." He went and made the coffee. He poured her a cup without asking, which was the right call, and he sat down across the table, and she told him. She showed him the option contract. She showed him how the debts had been engineered. She showed him the math, the careful, patient, 3-year math of a man who understood that the best way to take something from someone was to make them think they were losing it themselves. When she finished, Caleb sat with his coffee cup in his hands and was very quiet. "He wants the land," he said. "He wants the water rights that come with the land," she said, "and the grazing access. Your property controls more of this valley than most people realize, I think including you." Caleb set the cup down. "What do we do?" "We gather everything," she said. "Every document, every discrepancy, every signature that doesn't match. We build a case that's complete enough that when we bring it forward, there's no gap for him to slip through." She paused. "And we don't tell anyone. Not yet. If Blackwell finds out we're looking, the evidence we need might disappear before we can secure it." Caleb nodded. He looked at her across the table, across the documents, in the early morning light coming through the study window. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Not suspicious, genuinely curious. You could have taken the $20 I offered you, could have left." Eleanor considered the question. She thought about Millhaven, about her father's back as he drove the wagon away, about Wade Cutler's grin. "Because somebody decided I was worth $40, she said. "I'd like to spend some time around people who are interested in finding out what things are actually worth." Caleb Mercer looked at her for a moment longer. "Then we'd better get to work," he said. The weeks that followed moved in a rhythm that Eleanor had never experienced before, and found to her own surprise that she wanted. She worked the books in the mornings and the kitchen in the afternoons, and helped with whatever presented itself in between, mending equipment, updating the livestock records, working out the supply schedule for winter. She was not a rancher. She had never worked with cattle, and her first attempt to help drive a small group of strays back to the main herd resulted in an outcome that the hands pretended not to find as funny as they clearly did. But she learned. She was good at learning. Silas watched all of this with his sharp blue eyes and said very little, which she'd come to understand was his form of approval. When he did say something, it was usually either bluntly practical or unexpectedly perceptive. He'd grown up in the valley, had known Caleb Mercer's family for 2 generations. He knew every piece of land and every significant person in the county. One afternoon in mid-October, Eleanor found him sharpening a fence post while she was hanging laundry in the yard. "Blackwell's been asking around," he said, without preamble, without looking up from his work. She stilled. "What kind of asking?" "The casual kind," Silas said. "The kind where someone asks your neighbors how things are going over here, how the herd looks, whether you've seemed worried lately." He took a slow stroke with the tool. "The kind that means he's checking whether we know." "He doesn't know what I'm doing," Eleanor said. "Up." No, Silas agreed. But he knows Caleb hired on a woman who's good with numbers, and he's curious what that means. He paused. Blackwell's not a stupid man. No, Eleanor said. He's not. She went back to the laundry. How long have you known something was wrong? About 2 years, Silas said. But I'm an old man who never had any schooling past the 4th grade, and accounting's not something I can argue about from a position of ignorance. He set down the tool and looked at her directly. You're different. I'm a woman who got sold by her father, Eleanor said. I'm not sure how different that makes me. It makes you someone who has reason to prove things, Silas said. That's what I meant. Eleanor looked at him. The afternoon sun was at a low angle, throwing long shadows across the yard, and Silas Boone looked like what he was. An old man who'd been paying attention for 60-some years and had opinions about what he'd seen. I'll prove it, she said. I just need a little more time. Then you'd better hope Blackwell stays patient, Silas said, and went back to his fence post. Eleanor went back to her laundry, but that night she worked until 2 in the morning. She had almost everything she needed by the 1st of November. The documentation was thorough enough that she'd stopped second-guessing it and started planning how to use it. The picture was clear. Blackwell Land and Cattle, acting through a local intermediary whose name she'd eventually traced through the contracts, had been systematically draining the Mercer Ranch's liquidity for 3 years through fraudulent service contracts, inflated fees, and at least 2 agreements that Caleb had signed without understanding their implications. The long-term goal was obvious: starve the operation of capital until it couldn't service its legitimate debts, then move in on the option contract and acquire the land at a fraction of its value. It was elegant, as schemes went. And it had almost worked. Eleanor was cross-referencing the last set of records on a gray November afternoon when she heard a rider come into the yard. She didn't think much of it. Riders came and went, until she heard the voice through the study window, and something in it made her go still. The voice was smooth, accustomed to attention, the voice of a man who was so certain of his position that the certainty had become indistinguishable from his personality. She went to the window. The man on the horse in the yard was expensively dressed for a ranch visit. Not the kind of expensive that meant he didn't know what a ranch was, but the deliberate kind that meant he wanted you to notice the difference between you and him. He was talking to Caleb, who had come out of the barn, and he was smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Damian Blackwell. Eleanor stood at the window and watched him. He was here to look, she realized, not to do anything. To look at the ranch, at Caleb, at whatever could be read in the state of things, to assess how close the operation was to collapse. She watched him look around the yard, and she watched the moment his gaze moved to the house, moved to the study window, and stopped. He couldn't see her clearly. The light was wrong, but he could see the shape of someone at the window, and she could see his eyes narrow slightly. She didn't move. He looked away, back to Caleb, and kept talking. But something had shifted in his posture. Some new data had been filed away. Later, after he'd left and Caleb had come inside and told her what had been said, pleasantries, an inquiry about whether the ranch was managing the winter prep well, a vague reference to the ongoing contracts, Eleanor sat with the information and turned it over. He came to see me, she said. Caleb frowned. What? Not only you, she amended, but he knows someone's been going through the books. He wanted to see who. She paused. We need to move faster than I planned. How much faster? She looked at the documents on the table, at the months of careful work. I need 2 more weeks, she said. Can you hold things steady for 2 more weeks? I can hold things steady, Caleb said. She nodded. Then 2 weeks. She turned back to the documents. Somewhere across the valley, in the carefully organized study of a wealthy man who believed he had already won, Damian Blackwell was also thinking about 2 weeks. He was thinking that the woman at the Mercer Ranch window had not looked afraid. He didn't know what to do with that yet, but he would figure it out, and so would she. Outside the lamplight of the Mercer Ranch, the valley lay dark and still under a November sky full of cold stars. And 6 miles in every direction, the land waited, as it always did, for whoever proved themselves worthy of keeping it. Eleanor Hayes sat with her documents and her candle and her carefully organized evidence of a wrong she intended to right. She did not know yet what it would cost her. She did not know yet that Damian Blackwell had already decided that the easiest way to deal with a woman who knew too much was to make everyone believe she was the kind of woman whose word meant nothing. but she would find out, and she would be ready. The 2 weeks Eleanor had asked for turned into 10 days, because Blackwell didn't give her the full 2. She knew something had shifted on a Tuesday morning when Danny Pruitt came back from riding the fence line on the north pasture and found her in the kitchen with a look on his face that was trying to be neutral and not succeeding. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing," he said, then immediately contradicted himself. "Holt's brother came out from town this morning while I was on the north line. Said there's talk going around." Eleanor set down the coffee pot. "What kind of talk?" Danny was 18 and had not yet developed the capacity to deliver bad news without his ears going red. They were red now. "About you," he said. "And Caleb. People saying, that the arrangement isn't—" He stopped. "That it isn't proper." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Saying what exactly, Danny?" "That you're not here as a housekeeper." He said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. "That Caleb bought you and you're earning your keep. In a specific way." She picked up the coffee pot again and poured herself a cup and stood with it at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. The morning was gray, the sky low with the particular flat light of a November that hadn't decided whether to snow yet. "Who's saying it?" she asked. "Holt's brother heard it from the man who runs the feed store, who heard it from—" Danny stopped. "From someone. People don't always say where they heard things." She knew exactly where it had come from. She'd watched the source of it ride out of this yard 9 days ago on an expensive horse, with that assessing look in his eyes and the particular posture of a man who'd already made his next move before he'd finished making the current one. Damian Blackwell had decided that the easiest way to neutralize Eleanor Hayes was to make her radioactive. She drank her coffee and thought about it. She wasn't surprised. Not entirely. She'd known this was a possible play. What surprised her was the timing. He'd moved faster than she'd expected, which meant he was more concerned about the bookwork than she'd thought, which meant the evidence she was building was even more threatening to him than she'd calculated. Good, she thought, with a cold precision that was new to her. That's actually good. She found Caleb in the barn talking to Silas about winter feed storage and waited until there was a break in the conversation to pull him aside. "Blackwell's spreading rumors," she said, "about us. About what I'm doing here." His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes went tight. "What kind of rumors?" she told him plainly. He listened with his jaw set and his arms crossed, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'll go to town," he said. "I'll set people straight." "No," she said, more sharply than she'd intended, then more carefully. "No. That's what he wants. You going to town to defend me makes it look like there's something to defend. It draws more attention to the story, not less." She paused. "The only thing that kills a rumor like this is something that makes the rumor irrelevant. We need to finish what I'm building and bring it forward before he can do more damage." "Eleanor," his voice had an edge she hadn't heard before, "I'm not going to let people say that about you while I sit on my hands." "I'm not asking you to sit on your hands. I'm asking you to let me finish the job." She met his eyes. "If you go to town and argue with people, you spend your credibility defending a rumor. If we take what I've found to the county commissioners in 2 weeks, you spend your credibility destroying a fraud. Which one matters more?" He looked at her. She could see him working through it, the instinct pulling one way and the logic pulling the other, the particular frustration of a person who is right about wanting to do something and wrong about whether they should do it. 2 weeks, he said finally. "And then one way or another, we do something." 2 weeks, she agreed. What she didn't tell him was that she didn't think they had 2 weeks. But she had said it, and she intended to make it true. And so she went back to the study and worked until her eyes hurt. The rumors reached the ranch hands by Thursday. She knew because the dynamic in the kitchen shifted in the subtle, uncomfortable way of people who had heard something they weren't sure what to do with. Holt was quieter than usual. 2 of the other men found reasons to be elsewhere during meals. Danny Pruitt sat across from her at the table and made a point of talking to her normally, which was its own kind of evidence that things weren't normal. On Friday, she was reviewing the last set of contracts when Holt came to the study doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, and Eleanor waited, because she'd found that Holt McCready said things when he was ready to say them and not before, and pushing didn't help. "I've been here 4 years, he finally said. "Caleb's a straight man. Best I've worked for." He paused. I don't think what they're saying is true. It isn't, Eleanor said. I know it. Another pause. My sister married a man who had a reputation that wasn't earned. It took years for people to stop attaching it to her. Eleanor looked at him. I'm sorry. She's fine now, he said, with the brisk practicality of someone who had processed this a long time ago. I just want you to know that some of us know the difference between what people say and what's actually happening. He looked at the document spread across the table. You finding what you're looking for? Most of it, she said. He nodded. Then he said, Blackwell owns the feed store in town and the newspaper. He said it without emphasis, like he was noting the weather. In case that's useful information. It was. It meant the rumors had infrastructure, which meant they'd spread further and faster than organic gossip. She added it to her mental accounting. Thank you, Holt, she said. He shrugged and went back to work. But she noticed that at dinner that night, he made a point of sitting next to her at the table and asking her opinion on the north fence repair, loudly enough for everyone to hear. She noticed other things, too, in those last grinding days. The way Silas positioned himself between her and any stranger who came to the ranch. The way Danny started volunteering to drive her into town for supplies, even though she hadn't asked and didn't go. The way Caleb knocked on the study door every evening at 9 to ask if she needed anything, which she understood was less about what she needed and more about making sure she was still there. She thought about that sometimes in the odd hours of the night, when she was tired enough that her guard came down and she let herself look at things directly instead of through the careful glass of practicality. She thought about how long it had been since she'd felt like a person people arranged themselves around rather than a person who arranged herself to stay out of the way. She thought about what it meant that a man she'd known for 6 weeks knocked on her door every night to make sure she was all right, and that the gesture felt like more than courtesy. She put that thought away. There were more important things. On the 10th day after Blackwell's visit, she finished. She had the complete picture. 3 years of documented fraud, the option contract that proved premeditation, copies of all the contracts with the signature analysis that linked them to Blackwell's intermediary, and the financial math that showed precisely how much had been taken. She had organized everything into a clear sequence that could be followed by someone with no accounting knowledge, because the county commissioners were not accountants and she needed them to understand it without her having to explain every entry. She found Caleb at the barn at dusk. I'm done, she said. He looked at her. He'd known it was coming, but something in his face shifted anyway. Relief, and something more complicated than relief. Is it enough? He said. It's everything, she said. It's more than enough. He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, the horses moved in their stalls, and the day was going gray at the edges, and the cold that had been threatening all week was finally settling in from the north. You should know, he said carefully, that 3 people stopped me in town today when I went for the mail. 2 of them said they'd heard things and didn't believe them. One of them, he paused, one of them suggested I'd do better to send you on your way before the talk got worse. What did you tell them? She asked. I told them Eleanor Hayes has done more for this ranch in 6 weeks than most people do in a year, he said, and that I'd rather lose the opinion of every person in Millhaven than lose someone who actually knows what she's doing. Eleanor looked at him. The cold air moved between them, and the last light was going orange above the western ridgeline, and she had the strange sensation of being seen clearly by someone who had made up his mind about what he saw and wasn't looking to revise it. That might have been more than you needed to say, she told him. Probably, he agreed. I'm not always as strategic as you are. Nobody is, she said, and he laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite accommodation version, but the real kind. And it surprised her into something that wasn't quite a smile but was closer than she usually got. When do we go to the commissioners? He asked. Monday morning, she said. I want the weekend to go through everything one more time. He nodded. I'll send word to my lawyer. You have a lawyer? I have a man in Morganville I pay $20 a year to read things before I sign them, he said. I should have been using him more, evidently. She couldn't argue with that. Bring him Monday, she said. She spent the weekend going through the documents twice more, looking for gaps, testing the logic from every angle she could imagine Blackwell using. She ate her meals at the table with the hands and helped Danny Pruitt work out why the South Pasture's water trough was draining too fast, and listened to Silas tell a long story about a cattle drive he'd made in 1861 that she was fairly certain was 20% true and 80% what a good story required. On Sunday evening, Holt knocked on the study doorway. "Holt?" she said. He held out a piece of paper. "Letter came for you today, from Mill Haven." She took it. The handwriting on the front was her father's, and her stomach did something unpleasant before she made it stop. "Bad news?" Holt asked, watching her face. "I don't know yet," she said. She opened it. The letter was 8 lines long. Her father wrote that he had heard she was living on a ranch east of town and that he hoped she was well. He wrote that he had been thinking about her situation and that if things didn't work out as planned, she was welcome to come back and they could work out a new arrangement. He wrote that he was sure she understood he had done what he had to do. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases. "Well," Holt said. "Nothing important," she said, and set it aside and went back to her documents. She didn't think about the letter again that night. She had made her peace with Thomas Hayes a long time ago. Or not peace exactly, but the particular kind of detachment that comes from finally understanding someone completely and finding there is nothing left to want from them. He had done what he had to do. She was going to do the same. Monday morning came cold and clear, the sky a deep winter blue that made the valley look like something in a painting. Eleanor came downstairs at 5 to find Caleb already in the kitchen with the coffee made and a bowl of oats on the table for her. "Lawyer's meeting us in Morganville at 10, he said. "I'll be ready by 7, she said. She ate standing up, going over the sequence in her head one more time. Caleb drank his coffee and didn't talk, which was something she'd come to value about him. His ability to occupy the same space as another person without filling it unnecessarily. Silas came in at 6:30. He looked at Eleanor with those sharp blue eyes, and then he looked at the leather folder on the counter where she'd put the documents. "Today's the day," he said. "Today's the day," she agreed. He poured himself coffee and sat down heavily at the table. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've been working ranches in this valley for 40 years. I've watched 3 men lose their operations to Damian Blackwell. Good men, all of them, better with cattle than with paper." He looked at the folder again. Nobody ever had the paper before. Eleanor picked up the folder. "They do now," she said. She and Caleb rode to Morganville in the wagon with the documents between them, and the valley spread out on both sides of the road in the cold morning light, and Eleanor looked at it, the way the land ran, the creek systems that Blackwell had wanted control of, the quiet, enormous fact of a place that had been worth protecting all along. She thought about this first time she'd come this way, 6 weeks ago, riding east out of Millhaven with 62 cents and a room key that didn't exist yet, and nothing to her name except the dress she was wearing and the habit of surviving. She thought about the letter from her father in the study desk drawer. She thought about Monday morning at the county commissioner's office, and the look on Damian Blackwell's face when he realized that the woman he'd decided to reduce to a rumor had spent the past 6 weeks building a case that was going to take everything from him. The wagon rolled east through the cold November morning. Eleanor Hayes held the folder on her lap with both hands and did not look back. The valley waited ahead of her, the same as it had always been, indifferent to who crossed it, loyal only to whoever proved themselves willing to fight for it. She was willing. She was more than willing. She was ready. The meeting in Morganville did not go the way Eleanor had planned. Not because the evidence failed. The evidence was solid, and Caleb's lawyer, a thin, precise man named Arthur Gaines, who wore the same serious expression whether he was reading a contract or ordering lunch, had gone through the documents that morning and used the word compelling twice and damning once, which Eleanor understood to be high praise from a man who appeared constitutionally incapable of enthusiasm. The problem was that the county commissioners were not available. Not one of them. The clerk at the office, a young man with the anxious energy of someone who had been put in a difficult position and knew it, told them that Commissioner Aldridge had traveled to the Capitol on urgent business, that Commissioner Pruitt was ill, and that Commissioner Walsh was handling a property dispute on the far side of the county that required his personal attention. All 3 of them. On the same Monday. Eleanor stood at the counter and looked at the clerk and felt the shape of what had happened settle over her like cold water. "When are they expected back?" she asked. "Commissioner Aldridge returns Friday," the clerk said. He was not meeting her eyes, which told her something. "The others, I'm not certain of the exact dates." Is there a process for filing evidence in advance of a hearing? Arthur Gaines asked, in his careful, precise way. There is, the clerk said, but the filing has to be witnessed by at least one commissioner or an appointed deputy, and at present, there are none available, Eleanor finished. No, ma'am. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at the clerk with the expression of a man adding things up and not liking the total. They walked out into the cold Morganville street, and Arthur Gaines said carefully, "This could be coincidence." "It isn't," Caleb said. "No," Gaines agreed. "It probably isn't." He adjusted his hat against the wind. "He has friends on the commission. I should have anticipated this." He said it without drama, the way a man acknowledges a mistake in judgment that cost him something. "I'm sorry, Mercer." "Don't be sorry," Eleanor said. Tell me what the options are." Gaines thought about it for a moment, standing on the boardwalk with his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "We can file with the territorial court directly, bypassing the commission. It's slower, could be 6 to 8 weeks before anything is heard, but it removes the local variable." He paused. "Or we wait for Friday and Commissioner Aldridge." "How much does Blackwell own of Aldridge?" Caleb asked. Gaines's mouth tightened. "That's a question I don't have a documented answer to." "Then we go to the territorial court," Eleanor said. "Today, before anyone has time to arrange more coincidence." They filed with the territorial court that afternoon. Gaines knew the clerk there, a woman in her 40s who took the documents with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing, stamped them, and gave Eleanor a receipt that she folded and put in her coat pocket and kept her hand on for most of the ride home. It was a small victory. It felt like one. 6 to 8 weeks, Caleb said, on the wagon road back east. The sun was already going low, the short November day burning itself out early. 6 to 8 weeks, Eleanor confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "The banknote is due in 12. "I know. So we have some room." "Some," she said. "Not as much as I'd like." He flicked the reins, and the horse moved on, and Eleanor sat with the cold coming through her coat and thought about the shape of Blackwell's move. The elegance of it, the patience. You didn't have to do anything dramatic when you controlled enough of the infrastructure. You just rearranged the furniture until the person you were targeting had nowhere comfortable to stand. She was going to have to be just as patient, and she was running out of time to be. What she hadn't anticipated was that Blackwell wouldn't wait either. The first sign came 3 days later, when Eleanor walked into Mill Haven with Danny Pruitt to pick up supplies and felt the difference in the air the moment they stepped onto the main street. It was the particular social weather of a small town that has decided something about you. A slight adjustment in the angle of people's bodies, conversations that paused a beat too long, a woman she'd nodded to pleasantly twice before who found a reason to look into a shop window as they passed. The feed store was where it became concrete. The man behind the counter, who Eleanor had dealt with twice before without incident, looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and landing somewhere near hostile. And when she presented her list, he told her that the ranch's credit account had been suspended pending review. "What kind of review?" Danny asked. "Account irregularities," the man said, to a point about 6 inches to the left of Eleanor's face. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "The account has no irregularities. I've been through every transaction personally." "I'm just telling you what I was told," he said. She paid in the cash she'd brought, which covered most of the list, but not all of it. She and Danny loaded what they had into the wagon and didn't speak until they were out of town. "Blackwell owns the feed store," Danny said. "Yes," she said. "I know." "He can't cut off all our credit everywhere," Danny said, with the specific brand of optimism that belongs to people who haven't yet learned how much one determined wealthy man can accomplish when he decides to make your life difficult. "No," Eleanor said, "but he can make it uncomfortable enough that people start to wonder whether doing business with us is worth the trouble." Danny thought about that. "What do we do?" "We figure out what we absolutely need and where we can get it without going through his people," she said. "And we wait." Waiting was harder than working, which was the thing Eleanor had never quite managed to make peace with. Working gave you the feeling of moving towards something. Waiting just gave you time to think about everything that could go wrong. The rumors had metastasized. She learned this gradually, the way you learn about damage that's been spreading behind your walls. Not all at once, but in pieces, each piece worse than the one before. It wasn't just the question of propriety anymore. Now there were stories about her competence, her character, the nature of her relationship to Thomas Hayes, and why he might have been motivated to remove her from the household. This was constructed rather than observed, too detailed in the wrong places, too vague in the right ones, calibrated to be exactly unverifiable. She found out about all the worst of it from Silas, who was the one person on the ranch she could count on to tell her something she didn't want to hear without softening it past usefulness. He came to the study on a Thursday evening and stood in the doorway and said, "There's a piece in the Millhaven paper." She put down her pen. "What kind of piece?" "The kind that doesn't use your name," he said. "Uses enough detail to make sure everyone knows who it's about." He paused. "Says there are questions about financial irregularities at a local ranch operation, and that an unnamed woman hired on recently has been given unusual access to sensitive accounts, and that neighbors have expressed concern." Eleanor was quiet. "It's signed by the editor," Silas added. "Man named Croft. Blackwell owns the paper, so Croft does what Blackwell tells him to." She thought about the 6 weeks she'd spent in that study. The late nights, the careful documentation, the evidence she'd built piece by piece. She thought about how it was going to look to people who read that piece and didn't know what she actually knew. She thought about something she hadn't let herself think about until now, which was that this might not work. Not because the evidence wasn't good. It was good, she knew it was, but because evidence didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed inside a community, and communities could be turned against a person before the evidence ever got heard. She sat with that for a moment, then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The decision to leave came on a Sunday, and it surprised her by arriving not with drama, but with the quiet, flat certainty of something she'd been avoiding looking at directly. She had gone to Millhaven for the Sunday service that some of the hands attended, not for the service itself, but because Caleb had suggested that being visible and ordinary might help. And she had agreed with the logic, even though some part of her had known the logic was wrong. What happened was not dramatic. Nobody shouted at her. Nobody said anything openly, but she sat in the back of that church building and felt the particular suffocating quality of a community that had made up its mind, the way people arrange themselves with the careful precision of people who have decided you are not quite safe to sit next to. And she understood with the clarity that sometimes comes from being in exactly the wrong place, that she was not helping Caleb by staying. She was giving Blackwell ammunition. Every day she remained was another day he could point to as evidence of whatever story he was telling. Another day the rumors had to settle into fact in people's minds. She had come here with nothing, and she had built something, and now that something was being used against the person who had shown her basic human decency. And she could not make herself be comfortable with that. She packed her bag that Sunday evening. Not everything. The things she'd borrowed from Caleb's mother she left folded on the bed because they weren't hers. She packed what she'd arrived with, which was almost nothing, and she added the 2 dresses she'd been able to make from the fabric in the chest and the book Danny Pruitt had given her 3 weeks ago because he'd finished it and thought she'd like it, and she had. She wrote a letter to Caleb explaining her reasoning. She tried to write it twice without sentiment and failed both times. And the third version was still not quite right, but it was honest, and she left it on the study table next to the organized copy of the evidence file she'd been maintaining. She planned to be out before dawn. She was not. She came downstairs at 4:30 in the morning with her bag and found Caleb sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had been waiting for something he'd seen coming. "Sit down," he said. "I need to—" "Eleanor." He said her name in the same flat, quiet way he said most things, without heat but without any give in it. "Sit down." She sat. She set her bag on the floor beside her chair because she didn't know what else to do with it. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "Where are you planning to go?" "Morganville," she said. "There's a train at 7. I have enough for a ticket to Larkspur, and I know someone there who might—" "Why?" She looked at him. "Because I'm making things worse for you by being here." "That's not true." "Caleb, I don't care what people in Millhaven think," he said, and then stopped himself and tried again, more honestly. "I care, but I care about it less than I care about this ranch, and I care about this ranch less than I care about—" He stopped again. He picked up his coffee cup and put it down without drinking. "You're the only person who knows the full picture of what Blackwell has done. If you leave, we lose that. Not because the documents aren't there, but because you're the one who can explain it clearly. She looked at the table. Arthur Gaines can... Gaines is good with paper, Caleb said. He's not you. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Through the kitchen window, the yard was completely dark. The stars gone behind cloud cover, the kind of darkness that exists right before the world decides whether it's going to stay dark or turn toward morning. Silas told me about the newspaper piece, she said. I know. People are talking. People have always been talking about something, he said. When my father died and I took over this ranch at 22, people talked about whether I was old enough to run it. When I didn't marry by 25, people talked about whether something was wrong with me. When I hired Silas instead of a younger foreman, people talked about that too. He paused. People talk. The ranch either stands or it doesn't, and that's got nothing to do with what people say. This is different, she said. This is coordinated. Blackwell is building a case against your reputation, and mine is the foundation of it. And the answer to that is for you to disappear? He looked at her steadily. That's not logic, Eleanor. That's fear. The word landed with precision, and she felt the truth of it like a finger pressed on a bruise. Pshayet. Not with pleasure, but with the specific discomfort of accurate diagnosis. She didn't answer. I know what it feels like, he said, more quietly. To have people looking at you a certain way. To wonder if leaving would make things easier for everyone. I'm not saying it doesn't hurt. I'm saying that leaving doesn't fix it. It just gives the people who want you gone exactly what they want. Eleanor picked up her bag from the floor and set it on her lap and looked at it. Her mother's hairbrush was in there. The book from Danny. The 62 cents she'd had in her pocket the day she left Millhaven, which she'd kept and which she couldn't entirely explain why. If I stay, she said, and this gets worse, it might get worse, he agreed. Things sometimes do. And if your neighbors turn against you completely, if you lose business you can't afford to lose, he was quiet for a moment. I've been running this ranch alone for 8 years, he said. I know what I can lose and what I can't. He paused. You're in the second category. Eleanor sat very still. She understood what he meant. She was not certain she had the equipment to deal with it. That's not a fair thing to say, she told him, when I'm trying to make a practical decision. No, he agreed. It isn't. He didn't take it back. She sat at that table for what felt like a long time, with the dark outside and the kitchen warm and the coffee going cold between them and the sound of the ranch sleeping around her. The horses moving in the barn, the wind at the window, the distant particular quiet of land that has been worked for a long time. She thought about her father's letter in the desk drawer. She thought about what it felt like to be worth $40. She thought about 6 weeks of work in that study, the patterns she'd found and followed and documented into something real and defensible. She thought about Damian Blackwell sitting comfortably somewhere, waiting for the woman at the Mercer Ranch window to do exactly what she was doing right now. She put the bag on the floor. I'll stay, she said, but I need you to understand that I'm not staying because of what you just said. I'm staying because leaving now would be letting him win, and I don't know how to do that. Caleb Mercer looked at her with something in his face that was too complicated for her to name and that she wasn't ready to examine closely. All right, he said. And we need a different strategy, she said, because the one we're using isn't moving fast enough. What do you have in mind? She thought for a moment. She thought about the newspaper piece, about the credit suspension, about 3 county commissioners who had all been unavailable on the same Monday. She thought about what Silas had said. Nobody ever had the paper before, and about what it meant to have evidence that people were being prevented from seeing. He's controlling what people hear, she said slowly. He owns the paper. He has friends on the commission. He controls the credit for businesses that deal with us. She looked at Caleb. So we go around him. We don't wait for a hearing we might not get. We go to the people directly. What people? The ranchers in this valley, she said. The ones Blackwell hasn't bought. The ones who've been watching what happens to their neighbors for the past 5 years and wondering whether they're next. She paused. I need you to call them together. Not a formal meeting, just neighbors talking. And I need to show them the documents. Caleb sat with that for a moment. Some of them won't come. Some of them will, she said, and the ones who come will talk to the ones who don't. He nodded slowly. I can have something together by the end of the week. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he agreed. She picked up his cold coffee cup and took it to the stove to heat it, because it was 4:30 in the morning and neither of them had slept, and they were going to need to function, and it was the most practical thing she could do at this moment for the person in this room who had just said something she was going to have to figure out what to do with eventually. He watched her do it without comment. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said, not turning around. They didn't say anything else. The night moved toward morning, and the ranch breathed around them, and somewhere in the valley, Damian Blackwell was sleeping with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won, and Eleanor stood at the stove and waited for the coffee to heat, and planned what she was going to say on Thursday, and did not think about anything else at all. Except once, briefly, the way Caleb had said you're in the second category, with no performance in it and no calculation, just the flat, honest truth of someone who had decided to stop being careful about a thing. She pushed it down. There was too much work to do. The fire happened 4 days later. Eleanor was in the study at 11 at night when she smelled it. Not strongly at first, just the edge of something, the particular sharp quality of smoke that doesn't belong to a cooking fire or a hearth. She went to the window and looked north and saw the glow. It was the north barn. She was out the door before she had fully processed the decision to move, running across the yard in the dark with her boots unlaced and her heart already loud in her chest. The glow was brighter than she'd thought. Not a small thing, not a contained thing, the kind of fire that had been burning long enough to commit. The yard was chaos when she reached it. Caleb was already there, and Danny and Holt and the other hands were coming out of the bunkhouse. And someone was yelling about the horses in the near pasture, and someone else was yelling about water, and over all of it was the sound of the fire itself, a deep, hungry roaring that she felt in her chest as much as heard. Caleb was organizing the men into a line between the water trough and the barn when Silas grabbed his arm. "Caleb!" Silas's voice was not loud, but something in it cut through everything else. "The loft." Caleb turned. "I heard something," Silas said, "before you came out. Thought it was an animal, but—" He stopped. He was looking at the burning barn with an expression that was trying not to be afraid. "I think there's someone in the loft." Everything stopped, or seemed to. Eleanor watched Caleb Mercer make a calculation in 2 seconds that most men would have spent 10 minutes avoiding. She watched him look at the barn, at the fire, at Silas. She watched him look toward the south pasture where his cattle were running, scattered and panicked. The herd he'd spent 8 years building, moving away from them in the dark in a way that meant someone had opened the gate. She watched him choose. "Danny," he said, "get the men south, get the herd." He was already moving toward the barn. "Holt, get more water." "Eleanor." "I'm coming with you," she said. "Eleanor." "I'm not an argument," she said, and followed him. The heat hit her at 20 feet, a wall of it, physical and aggressive, the kind of heat that isn't just warmth but pressure, that pushes back. The barn door was not yet fully caught, the fire concentrated in the loft above, and Caleb hit the door with his shoulder and it gave and they were inside. The smoke was thick and low and moved like something with intention. Eleanor pulled her collar up over her nose and followed Caleb through it, orienting herself by memory because visibility was nearly nothing, toward the ladder at the back of the barn that led to the loft. "Silas!" Caleb shouted. Nothing. Then, from somewhere above them and to the left, a sound that might have been a voice. Caleb went up the ladder. Eleanor held the base of it and coughed into her sleeve and watched the fire eat along the rafters above her and thought with a specific, focused clarity that she needed to not be afraid right now because being afraid would make her slow, and slow was not an option. She heard Caleb's voice from above and Silas's voice answering, and the sound of something heavy being moved. Then Caleb's boots on the ladder rungs coming down, and below him Silas, moving slower than he should, his hand on each rung like he needed to find it. They were at the bottom of the ladder when the first section of the loft floor gave way. The sound was enormous. Not a crack, but a collapse. A section of burning wood coming down in a cascade of ember and ash that hit the barn floor 15 feet to their right and sent a wave of heat outward that knocked Eleanor back a step. Caleb grabbed Silas's arm, and they moved for the door, and Eleanor moved with them. And they were through it and into the cold yard, and the cold air was so sudden after the heat that it felt like falling into water. Silas bent double and coughed for a long time. His left hand was burned, well, not badly, but visibly, red and angry in the firelight. Eleanor looked at it, and then at Caleb, who was checking Silas over with the efficient attention of a man who cared about the person in front of him and wasn't going to say so dramatically. "I'm fine," Silas said between coughs. "Stop fussing." "You're not fine," Caleb said. "Your hand needs water. Eleanor—" She was already moving toward the trough. She brought water and clean cloth from the kitchen, and she sat with Silas in the yard while the barn burned and the hands fought it from a distance, and the north wall eventually came down in a slow, terrible lean that sent sparks high into the dark sky. There was nothing left to save in the barn. It was going to burn until it didn't anymore, and Holt's crew in the south pasture were doing what they could with the cattle, and Caleb stood in the yard with his hands at his sides and watched the barn go and said nothing. Eleanor sat with Silas and wrapped his hand and listened to the fire and thought about what this meant. Not just the barn. The barn was a loss, a significant one, but it was a material thing, and material things could be rebuilt. She was thinking about the cattle in the south pasture, about how many of them had gotten out, about the timing of this. Someone had opened that gate. "Silas," she said quietly. He was calmer now. The coughing mostly stopped. "Were you in the barn when the fire started?" "I went in late," he said. "Heard something outside about 9. Thought it might be a coyote near the fence." He looked at his wrapped hand. "It wasn't a coyote." "No," she said. "Did you see anyone?" "I saw the fire before I saw anything else," he said. "And then I was stuck up in that loft with a beam across the door." He paused. "Someone put that beam there, Eleanor, from outside." She was quiet. "Somebody wanted me in there," he said. He wasn't dramatizing it, he was just stating it, in the flat way of a man who had been around long enough to know that some things were exactly what they looked like. Eleanor looked at the burning barn, at Caleb standing in front of it, not moving, at the hands coming back from the south pasture with what cattle they'd managed to turn, which was not all of them. This was not intimidation anymore. Intimidation was rumors and credit accounts and commissioners who happened to be unavailable. This was something past that. This was the move of a man who had decided that patience wasn't working and that it was time to do damage. Caleb came to them eventually, when the barn had gone from actively burning to the kind of slow, sullen fire that knows it's already won and is just finishing the job. He looked at Silas's hand. He looked at Eleanor. "How bad?" he said. "He'll be all right," Eleanor said. Caleb crouched down in front of Silas, which was not something she'd seen him do before, make himself lower than another person. And he looked at the old man with an expression that was unguarded, in the way exhaustion sometimes makes people unguarded. "I'm sorry," he said. "This happened on my land. I should have had someone watching." "You can't watch everything," Silas said. "And if you try, you end up watching nothing properly." "How many head did we lose?" Caleb asked, looking at Holt, who had come up behind Eleanor. "Somewhere between 60 and 80, Holt said. "Could be fewer once we do a full count in the morning. Could be more." Caleb absorbed that. 60 to 80 head, plus the barn, plus whatever had been in it, in one night. Eleanor watched his face and thought about what it cost a person to stand in front of a loss that size and not come apart. She thought about all the small things she'd learned about this man over 6 weeks. The way he checked on his hands, the way he listened, the way he'd gone up that ladder into a burning barn for a 60-year-old man without stopping to weigh the calculation. And she thought about how none of those things were convenient, and none of them were strategic, and all of them were real. She thought about what she'd almost done that Sunday morning with her bag packed. She thought about what it would have cost to not be here tonight. "We'll do the count at first light," Caleb said, standing. He looked at the smoldering barn. "Tonight we make sure everyone's accounted for and everyone's all right." He paused. "The rest we figure out in the morning." Eleanor stood. Her hand smelled like smoke, and her eyes were burning from it, and the cold was seeping through her coat now that the heat of the barn was gone. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "Someone locked Silas in the loft," she said, "and someone opened the south pasture gate." He was quiet. "This wasn't an accident," she said. "No," he said, "it wasn't." They stood together in front of the smoldering remains of the north barn, and the smoke rose into the cold November sky, and the valley was dark and still around them, and Eleanor thought about Damien Blackwell sleeping somewhere comfortable and believed with absolute certainty that he was not sleeping at all. He was waiting to see what they did next. She was going to make sure he didn't like the answer. The cattle count at first light was 73 head short. Holt delivered the number to Caleb at the kitchen table with the flat, careful tone of someone who understood that the information was going to hurt and wasn't going to soften it by packaging it differently. 73 head, plus the barn and everything in it. Tools, winter feed stores, 2 saddles that had belonged to Caleb's father. The financial damage was significant enough that Eleanor didn't need to run the numbers to know what it meant for the banknote due in 12 weeks. She ran them anyway, because knowing exactly where you stood was better than guessing, even when exactly where you stood was bad. Caleb sat with the number for a while without saying anything. Danny Pruitt was at the stove making coffee with the focused attention of someone who needed to be doing something useful, and this was the most useful thing available. Holt sat across from Caleb with his hat on the table in front of him. Silas was in the chair near the window with his bandaged hand resting on his knee, looking out at the yard where the smoke was still rising from the barn in thin, defeated wisps. "We can make the note," Eleanor said. She had the figures on the paper in front of her. "Barely. It would mean selling off the South herd earlier than planned and at whatever price we can get rather than waiting for the spring market. We'd lose probably 15% on the value." "And after that?" Caleb said. "After that, we're operational but thin," she said. "No margin for another bad event." Nobody said what they were all thinking, which was that another bad event was exactly what Blackwell was going to arrange if they didn't stop him first. The territorial court filing had been stamped and received. Arthur Gaines had sent word that the case was in the queue and that they should expect a hearing date within 6 weeks. 6 weeks was not fast enough. 6 weeks was the kind of timeline that made sense in a world where the person you were filing against wasn't actively burning down your property and driving off your cattle in the interim. Eleanor looked at the figures again. She looked at Caleb. She thought about Thursday's meeting, which had happened 3 days before the fire, in this same kitchen, with 7 of the neighboring ranchers who had agreed to come. She thought about their faces when she'd laid out the documents, the slow, uncomfortable recognition of people who had been watching the same thing happen from different angles without ever seeing the full shape of it. 3 of them had asked to take copies of specific documents. 2 of them had said, carefully, that they had their own records that might be relevant. One man, a rancher named Chester Webb, who had the permanent squint of someone who spent his life outdoors, had sat at the end of the table and not said anything until everyone else was done, and then he'd said, "I lost my east pasture to Blackwell 2 years ago, signed a contract I didn't understand, fell behind on a payment I didn't know I owed, and he had a survey filed before I could get a lawyer." He'd looked at Eleanor's documents. "I kept my copies." Chester Webb's copies were now in the study, added to Eleanor's file, which had grown from a single leather folder to something considerably larger and more comprehensive and considerably more damning. The problem was that the hearing was 6 weeks away and the barn was already ash. She was sitting with this on the morning after the fire, looking at the numbers and the timeline and the gap between them, when she heard a wagon come into the yard. She went to the window. It was Chester Webb. And behind him, another wagon, and behind that a third. She went outside. Webb climbed down from his wagon and looked at the smoldering barn with the expression of a man who had seen this kind of thing before, which he probably had. Behind him, the 2 other wagons were carrying people she recognized from Thursday's meeting, a rancher named Aldous Farr and his eldest son, and a woman named Margaret Selby, who ran the operation. Her husband had left her when he died 4 years ago, and who had said almost nothing at Thursday's meeting, but had listened with a precision that Eleanor had noticed and respected. "Heard about the fire," Webb said to Caleb. "Word travels," Caleb said. "Word traveled because I made sure it did," Webb said without apology. "I sent riders to the people from Thursday, and to a few who weren't there." He looked at Eleanor. "We've been waiting for something to push us, Miss Hayes. Last night was it." Margaret Selby had gotten down from the second wagon and was already looking at the barn. "We can have the frame up in 3 days if we start today," she said, to no one in particular. "I've got lumber from a project I didn't finish." "Aldous?" "Got tools," Farr said, "and my boy can work." Caleb stood in his yard and looked at these people who had driven out at first light after hearing about his barn, and Eleanor watched something move across his face that he didn't have language for and didn't try to express. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We know," Webb said. That's the point. They worked through the day, clearing debris, salvaging what could be salvaged, beginning the layout for the new frame. Eleanor worked alongside them, not because she knew anything about barn construction, but because standing apart while other people worked was not something she was capable of, and because there was always something useful that needed doing adjacent to the main work. She organized food. She kept track of what lumber had come and what was still needed. She listened to the conversations happening around her and filed away what was useful. What was useful was this. 3 of the people working on the barn that day had their own stories about Damian Blackwell. Not as dramatic as what had happened to the Mercer Ranch, but in the same pattern. Inflated fees, contracts with buried terms, pressure applied at exactly the moment when a person was least equipped to push back. One man had paid what he still believed was an inflated survey fee simply because Blackwell's intermediary had shown up at the worst possible time, right after a bad winter, and he hadn't had the energy to fight it. Eleanor listened and thought about the hearing. 6 weeks. A formal proceeding in a territorial court where Blackwell would have lawyers and connections and the particular institutional weight of a wealthy man who had operated in this territory for years. She had documentation and arithmetic and the testimony of people who had been victimized but who were, in the eyes of the court, unconnected individuals with individual grievances rather than a pattern. Unless they weren't unconnected, unless they were exactly the pattern. She found Arthur Gaines by telegraph that evening, sending a message through the Morganville office asking him to come to the ranch at his earliest convenience. His reply came the next morning. He would be there Thursday. When he arrived, Eleanor spread everything on the study table. Not just the Mercer documents, all of it, Webb's records, Farr's contract with the buried survey fee clause, Margaret Selby's account of a water rights negotiation that had somehow resulted in Blackwell holding options on a creek that ran through her north pasture. The account from the man who had paid the inflated fee after the bad winter. Gaines stood at the table and read through it in silence for 40 minutes. Then he sat down, which was the first time Eleanor had seen him sit during a working session, and said, "This is not 6 individual cases." "No," Eleanor said. "This is a pattern of predatory fraud conducted systematically against multiple landowners over at least 4 years," he said. He sounded like a man whose professional caution was being tested by genuine outrage. "This changes the nature of the filing significantly." "I know," she said. "Can we amend what's already with the territorial court?" "We can file a supplemental," he said. "And more importantly," he stopped. He looked at the documents again. "More importantly, this scale of fraud may qualify for direct intervention by the Territorial Attorney General's office, rather than waiting for a civil hearing." Eleanor had been hoping he would say that. She had in fact been planning on it, which was why she hadn't mentioned it herself. She'd needed Gaines to arrive at it through the evidence rather than through her suggestion, because Gaines arriving at it himself meant it was legally sound rather than wishful thinking. "How quickly?" she asked. "If I take this to the AG's office directly, and I know someone there, we were at school together, which matters. We could have a response within 2 weeks." He paused. "It would help to have an affidavit from each of your additional witnesses, written, signed, witnessed." "I'll have them by the weekend," she said. He looked at her across the table. He was not an expressive man, but something in his face was doing something adjacent to admiration, the slightly uncomfortable expression of a person who is revising their assessment of someone upward faster than they'd planned to. "Miss Hayes," he said, "did you anticipate this development when you organized Thursday's meeting?" "I thought it was possible," she said. "You thought it was necessary," he said. She didn't argue with that. The affidavits took 4 days, not 3, because 2 of the witnesses needed convincing that their testimony wouldn't expose them to retaliation before the case was resolved. And Eleanor spent considerable time sitting at kitchen tables across the valley walking people through the logic of why coming forward now was safer than waiting. She was not always patient about it. She was honest about that. There were moments when the combination of exhaustion and urgency made her tone sharper than was useful, and she had to walk it back and try again. But she got there. Gaines left for the territorial capital on a Friday morning with a case file that was 3 times the size of what they'd originally filed, and a letter of introduction to the Assistant Attorney General written by Chester Webb, who had apparently been at school with him at some point, because this valley was smaller than it looked. 2 days after Gaines left, the bank notice arrived. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Caleb brought it in from the mail. She knew what it was before he opened it from the particular quality of stillness that came over him when he looked at the envelope. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of the chair across from her and waited. He opened it. He read it. He set it on the table between them. It was a demand for an immediate payment, citing a provision in the loan agreement that allowed the bank to call the full note in the event of significant asset loss. The barn and the cattle qualified as significant asset loss. The full amount was due in 30 days. 30 days. Eleanor read it twice and then turned it over so she wasn't looking at it and thought carefully about what she knew and what she could do with what she knew. The bank note, she said. Who holds it? Territorial Savings and Trust, Caleb said. Who owns Territorial Savings and Trust? A pause. I don't know who all the investors are. I might, she said. She went to the study and came back with a specific document, one she'd set aside 3 weeks ago because it hadn't fit anywhere obvious in the main file and she'd been uncertain of its relevance. It was a list of investors in a land development company that Blackwell had incorporated 4 years ago. She ran her finger down the column of names. Territorial Savings and Trust was listed as a co-investor, which meant probably, not certainly, but probably, that Blackwell had reached into the bank, which meant the 30-day notice was not an independent financial decision. It was coordinated. It was the same mechanism the commissioner's absence had been, the same mechanism the credit suspension had been. Another door closing, another exit blocked, another wall going up. She showed Caleb the document. He looked at it for a long time. He planned all of this, Caleb said. Not a question. The fire accelerated the timeline, Eleanor said. But yes, the option contract, the loan provision, the bank connection, these were always the end game. Bleed the operation, trigger the note, acquire the land, she paused. He moved faster than he planned to because of us, because he knew we were building something. Can Gaines do anything about the bank note? I sent him a telegram this morning, she said. He thinks he can file for a stay pending the fraud investigation. It's not guaranteed. Caleb sat with that. He looked like a man doing what she'd watched him do before, taking something that was bad and finding the floor of it, the actual bottom, and standing on that rather than falling through it. 30 days, he said. Gaines has 2 weeks to get a response from the AG's office. If we get intervention, the stay is almost certain. She looked at him. We need to get through 2 weeks. We can get through 2 weeks, he said. She believed him, which surprised her slightly. She was not a person who had historically found it easy to believe what men told her about their intentions and their capability. But Caleb Mercer had a specific quality she'd identified but never quite found the right word for. A consistency between what he said and what he did that was so reliable it had eventually stopped surprising her and become simply a fact of the environment she was operating in. The 2 weeks were not easy. She didn't expect them to be. Blackwell made his next move on the 8th day, which was a new piece in the Millhaven paper, more pointed this time, signed with Croft's name, but with the particular phrasing of someone who had been told what to write. It named Eleanor specifically, without the earlier pretense of protecting her anonymity, and described her as a woman of uncertain background who had inserted herself into a vulnerable operation and was making decisions beyond her competence and authority. It used the word inappropriate 4 times. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table and then folded it and used it to level the short leg on the study table that had been bothering her for a week. Holt watched her do this and said nothing, but she heard him tell Danny about it later, and Danny laughed, and the sound of it carried through the house in a way that helped more than she would have admitted. On the 11th day, Arthur Gaines sent a telegram. Eleanor read it standing at the telegraph office window in Morganville with Caleb beside her, and the telegraph operator pretending not to be reading over her shoulder. The telegram said, AG office reviewing, intervention likely. Hearing scheduled. Morganville Courthouse. 2 weeks. All parties required. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Caleb. He read it. He handed it back. He looked out the window at Morganville's main street for a moment, at the ordinary commerce of an ordinary day, people going about their business in the cold December air. 2 more weeks, he said. And then a courthouse, she said. You ready for that? Eleanor folded the telegram and put it in her coat pocket, next to the original receipt from the territorial court filing, next to the 62 cents she still had no reasonable explanation for keeping. "Yes," she said, and she was. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the scope of the hearing, the way word had spread through the valley in the days after Gaines had been working, the way people had talked to other people who had talked to other people, so that when the day came and she and Caleb and Arthur Gaines walked into the Morganville courthouse, the room was full. Not just their people, not just Webb and Farr and Margaret Selby and the other ranchers who had given affidavits. The room was full of people who had no stake in the case, except the particular human stake of people who live near an injustice and have been watching it operate for long enough that they are tired of watching. Blackwell was already there when they came in. He was sitting at a table with two lawyers and the particular posture of a man who was confident in his position. And he looked at Eleanor when she walked in the same way he'd looked at the window that November afternoon, assessing, recalibrating, deciding what she represented. She looked back at him without expression and took her seat. The three commissioners on the panel settled themselves at the front of the room. Commissioner Aldridge, who had been in the Capitol on urgent business the day Eleanor and Caleb had first tried to file, looked like a man who was regretting several decisions and was hoping it didn't show. Arthur Gaines leaned toward Eleanor and said quietly, "You'll go third, after I present the financial documentation and Webb gives his testimony. I want the commissioners to have the full picture before they hear you explain it." "How long do I have?" she said. "As long as you need," he said. "Don't rush it." She nodded. She sat in that courthouse with the documented evidence of 3 years of systematic fraud in the file on the table in front of her, and she looked at Damian Blackwell across the room, and she thought about Millhaven's main street in September, about a wagon rolling away and 62 cents and a room she hadn't seen yet. She thought about what it cost a person to decide they were worth fighting for. She thought about the north barn going up in smoke and Caleb going up that ladder without stopping to calculate. She thought about Silas's burned hand and Danny's freckled face, and Holt saying, "I think it'd be useful to have someone look at those books who isn't afraid to say what they see." She opened the file. She was ready to say what she saw. Arthur Gaines went first, and he was good at it. Precise, methodical, the kind of presentation that didn't try to be dramatic because it didn't need to be. He walked the commissioners through the financial documentation in sequence, building the architecture of the fraud the way you'd build a structure. One beam at a time, making sure each piece was load-bearing before moving to the next. The two lawyers at Blackwell's table objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Chester Webb went second. He was not a polished speaker and didn't pretend to be. He stood up in his worn coat and talked about the east pasture he'd lost, and the contract he hadn't understood, and the survey that had been filed before he could get anyone to explain it to him, and the plainness of it. The specific, unadorned quality of a man describing something that had actually happened to him landed in the room differently than legal argument did. Eleanor watched the commissioners' faces while Webb talked. Aldridge was looking at the table. The other two were looking at Webb. Then Gaines said, "The commission will now hear from Eleanor Hayes," and she stood up. The room was not quiet in the way a room is quiet when nothing is happening. It was quiet in the way a room gets when people have collectively decided to pay attention, which is a different and more demanding thing. Eleanor felt it, the weight of all that attention, the specific pressure of being looked at by a large number of people at once. She had spent 24 years learning to be invisible. She understood, standing there, that this was the last place she would ever be able to use that skill. She was going to have to be the opposite of invisible, clearly and completely, and she was going to have to do it in front of a man who had spent months trying to make her disappear. She opened the file. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said. "I am not a lawyer or an accountant. I am a woman who spent 6 weeks going through 3 years of financial records, and what I found in those records is what I'm going to show you today." She started with the simplest thing, the first fraudulent contract, the one for water rights that had been filed in year 1. She held up the document, she held up the corresponding entry in the ranch ledger, and she showed exactly where they didn't match and why the discrepancy wasn't an error. She spoke in plain language. She did not use terms she hadn't already defined. She watched the commissioners' faces, and when she saw confusion, she stopped and explained. And when she saw understanding, she moved forward. Blackwell's lawyers objected 4 times in the first 20 minutes. Each time, she waited for the commissioner to rule, and 3 of the 4 times the objection was overruled, and the 1 time it was sustained, she simply moved to the next document and continued. She was not calm exactly. She was too conscious of Blackwell across the room to be calm, too aware of what was at stake, too aware of Caleb sitting behind her and Silas with his bandaged hand, and Danny Pruitt's freckled face in the second row. But she was focused in a way that felt like calm from the outside, and she had learned long ago that the functional difference between actual calm and focused determination was small enough not to matter. She got to the option contract 40 minutes in. This document, she said, holding it up, was included in a water rights agreement signed in the second year of the scheme. The water rights agreement is 2 pages. This clause is on page 7 of the attached addendum. She paused. It gives Blackwell Land and Cattle Company the right to acquire the Mercer property at assessed value in the event of foreclosure. The assessed value cited in the clause is the assessed value from 4 years ago, before improvements to the property that Caleb Mercer made at his own expense, which increased its value by approximately 30%. She set it down. This was not an oversight. To put this clause in an addendum rather than the main body of the contract, to use an outdated assessed value, and to do it in a contract that appears on the surface to be about water access, that is a choice. It requires specific knowledge of property law and specific intent. One of Blackwell's lawyers stood. Objection. The witness is characterizing intent without evidentiary basis. The document characterizes itself, Eleanor said, and waited. The commissioner looked at the lawyer. Overruled. Continue, Miss Hayes. She continued. She laid out the full 3-year timeline, not just the Mercer contracts, but the pattern across multiple properties, the way the same structure repeated with variations calibrated to the specific vulnerability of each target. Webb's East Pasture, Farr's survey fee, Margaret Selby's creek options, the man who had paid rather than fight after the bad winter. When she finished, the room was very still. Commissioner Aldridge, who had been in the Capitol on urgent business the day she and Caleb had first tried to file, who had spent the last hour looking increasingly like a man who wished he were somewhere else, cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwell, he said, do you wish to respond at this time? Damian Blackwell stood. He was a composed man by nature and by practice, and the composure was still there, but Eleanor could see the edges of it. She could see the small recalculation happening behind his eyes. The same assessment she'd seen that November afternoon in the yard. The same measuring of variables. But the variables had changed, and they both knew it. These documents have been selectively presented, he said. His voice was smooth. Without the full context of the business relationships involved, what appears to be a pattern is simply Mr. Blackwell. The commissioner who spoke was not Aldridge, but a woman named Hargrove, the third commissioner, who had said almost nothing since the hearing began. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. Are you disputing the authenticity of these documents? A pause. Brief, but Eleanor caught it. The documents are authentic, he said. The interpretation was explained to us in considerable detail, Hargrove said. What I'm asking is whether the documents themselves accurately reflect the contracts you entered into. Another pause. His lawyers were doing something at the table behind him that involved a great deal of quiet urgency. The contracts reflect business arrangements made in good faith, Blackwell said. It was not quite an answer. Everyone in the room knew it was not quite an answer, and the fact that a man of his resources and preparation was giving non-answers was itself a kind of answer. Then he made the mistake. Eleanor didn't see it coming. She had been watching his lawyers, who were showing the signs of people managing a situation that was going worse than planned, and she almost missed the moment when Blackwell's composure slipped its leash. Commissioner, he said, and his voice had an edge in it now that hadn't been there before, I would ask the commission to consider the source of these allegations. This woman, he paused, and she heard it in that pause, heard him selecting the word, heard the specific contempt of a man who had been underestimating her for months and had just run out of room to hide it. This woman appeared in this county in September with nothing to her name, installed herself in a vulnerable man's household under circumstances that the community has already noted and questioned, and is now presenting herself as some kind of authority on complex financial matters she has no professional qualification to assess. The room shifted. It was a physical thing, almost the way a few hundred people collectively reassessing something changes the quality of the air. Eleanor stood very still. She had prepared for this. She had known, in the way you know things about people who have already shown you who they are, that this was available to him, and that he might reach for it when the evidence made other options unavailable. She had prepared a response. She didn't use it. Because before she could, Chester Webb said, from the second row, in a voice that was not loud but carried clearly, "She found what nobody else did. That qualifies her well enough for me." And Margaret Selby said, "She explained my own contract to me better than the man who sold it to me." And Holt McCready, who was not a man who spoke in public and who was sitting in the back row with his hat on his knee, said simply, "That's a low thing to say about a person." Damian Blackwell turned to look at the room. He looked at the faces looking back at him, not with hostility, not yet, but with the specific expression of people who have watched someone confirm something they already suspected. Eleanor let the moment sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she said to the commissioners, "What Mr. Blackwell just said about me is consistent with what he has been saying about me since November, through his newspaper, his business contacts, and his social connections in this valley. I've been aware of it. I didn't come here today to defend my reputation. I came here to show you the documents." She picked up the file. "The documents don't change based on who presents them." Hargrove looked at Blackwell's lawyers. "Do you have anything substantive to add?" The lawyers conferred. One of them stood and said they would need time to prepare a formal response to the newly presented evidence, which was the thing lawyers say when the evidence is too strong to respond to today, and they need to buy time to figure out whether it's possible to respond to it at all. Hargrove looked at the other commissioners. Aldridge was studying the documents Eleanor had presented. The third commissioner, a man named Rourke, who had spent most of the hearing taking notes, said, without looking up, "I think we've heard enough to act on the preliminary matter." The commissioners withdrew to confer. They were gone for 31 minutes, which Eleanor knew because she was watching the clock on the courthouse wall and because the alternative was looking at Damian Blackwell, who was at his table talking quietly with his lawyers and not looking at her. Caleb moved from his seat behind her to sit beside her while the commissioners were out. He didn't say anything. He just sat down in the chair next to her and put his elbows on the table, and the presence of him was enough, and she didn't have to say so. When the commissioners came back, Hargrove spoke. The option contract was void. The fraudulent service contracts were unenforceable. The commission was referring the full matter to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for Criminal Investigation, which Gaines had already arranged, but which carried considerably more weight coming from the commission than from a private filing. The bank note— Hargrove paused here and looked at Aldridge, and something passed between them that Eleanor couldn't entirely read but understood to be about the bank's connection to Blackwell. The banknote would be reviewed in the context of the fraud investigation before any collection action could proceed. Blackwell's lawyers immediately began talking. Hargrove talked over them. And then the sheriff, who had been standing near the back wall, walked forward and said something quietly to Damian Blackwell. And Blackwell's composure finally did what it had been threatening to do for the last 2 hours. It didn't collapse dramatically. Nothing about the man was dramatic. It just left. Like weather changing, like a lamp running out of oil. One moment he was a powerful man managing a difficult situation, and the next moment he was simply a man who had run out of moves, sitting in a chair in a courthouse while the things he had built around himself came apart. Eleanor watched it happen and felt, not satisfaction, not exactly, something more complicated. The feeling you get when something that was wrong for a long time becomes right, which is relief, but relief mixed with all the cost of what it took to get there. The room took a moment to absorb what had happened. Then it did what rooms do when something that felt inevitable finally occurs. It exhaled collectively, and people started talking to each other, and the formal stillness of the hearing dissolved into the ordinary human noise of people processing a significant thing. Chester Webb shook Eleanor's hand and then shook it again, apparently because once hadn't felt like enough. Danny Pruitt said Miss Hayes 3 times in a row, each time with the expression of someone who had something else to say and hadn't found it yet. Margaret Selby put her hand briefly on Eleanor's arm and said, "Come find me if you need anything," which was the most she'd said directly to Eleanor in 2 months and meant more for its scarcity. Silas found her near the door. He stood in front of her with his bandaged hand and his 60-year-old face and his sharp blue eyes, and he said, "I've been watching people do difficult things for a long time. That was one of the more difficult things I've watched." "Thank you, Silas," she said. Don't thank me, he said. I didn't do anything. You told me to look at the books, she said. That was everything. He thought about that. Well, he said, you were worth telling. She had to look away for a moment after that, at the window and the gray December sky outside it, because Silas was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and the weight of it landed somewhere she hadn't expected. The days that followed were not simple, because nothing that follows a hard thing is ever simple. The criminal investigation moved at its own pace, which was slower than Eleanor would have liked and faster than Blackwell's lawyers had hoped. Arthur Gaines filed the papers to void the banknote pending the investigation, and the bank, without Blackwell's infrastructure supporting it, agreed to a restructured payment schedule that gave Caleb room to operate. The South herd sold at a 15% loss, as predicted, which was bad but manageable. The new barn frame went up in 4 days with neighborhood labor, which was not as fast as Margaret Selby had predicted, but faster than any of them could have done alone. Blackwell was formally charged in January. Eleanor heard this from Gaines, who sent a letter that arrived on a cold morning when the ground was frozen and the ranch was running on winter rhythms, slower and quieter. She read it at the kitchen table and then put it down and finished her coffee. Caleb read it after her. He set it on the table. It's over, he said. The legal part is over, she said. The rest takes longer. He looked at her. What's the rest? She thought about this valley, the ranchers who had come forward, the ones who hadn't. The people in Millhaven who had laughed at an auction in September and would have to decide what to do with that memory. The man named Croft, who had written things in a newspaper because he was told to and would have to live in the same community as the people he'd written about. Communities take a long time to repair, she said. When trust gets used as a weapon, it doesn't come back all at once. He nodded slowly. He knew this was true. He'd seen it. The opportunities came in February. Letters, 2 of them, arriving in the same week. One from a bank in Larkspur offering her a position managing accounts, citing her work on the fraud case as a demonstration of capability. One from a land agency in the capital asking whether she would consider consulting on disputed property documentation. She left both letters on the study desk for 3 days without answering them. She went about the work of the ranch, the accounts, the kitchen, the fence line she'd learned to check properly by watching Holt do it 12 times. She talked to Silas about the spring herd plan. She helped Danny Pruitt understand why the North Pasture's soil drainage was affecting the grass quality. Because he'd asked and she'd figured it out, and the explaining of it to someone else made it feel like something worth knowing. On the 3rd day, Caleb found her in the study with the 2 letters and asked if she'd decided. I'm thinking about it, she said. He sat down across from her. What are you thinking? That a year ago I would have taken either of those letters without hesitating, she said, because having somewhere to go would have been enough. She looked at the letters. I'm trying to figure out if that's still true. He was quiet for a moment. Is it? No, she said. It isn't. He said nothing. He had a quality she'd come to depend on without fully realizing it, the ability to be in a conversation without pushing it toward the conclusion he wanted. He was waiting for her to get there on her own, because he understood that was the only way it would mean anything. I built something here, she said. Not to him particularly, to the room, to herself, to the fact of it. I'm not sure I want to walk away from it to go build something for someone else. Then don't, he said. It's not that simple. Sometimes it is, he said. Sometimes you just decide. She looked at him across the study table, across the space where the fraud documents had been for months, and where now there were just the ordinary accounts of an operating ranch. The real numbers, the honest ones, the numbers that told the actual story of a place that was going to survive. She thought about the first night in this room, the candle on the windowsill, the sound of the ranch settling around her. She thought about Silas saying you were worth telling and the way that had landed somewhere she hadn't expected and hadn't left. She thought about $40 and what it meant to have believed for a long time that that was a fair accounting. There's something I want to show you, Caleb said. If you have a little time. She looked at the letters. She put them in the desk drawer. I have time, she said. He took her north on horseback, up the ridge that ran along the property's edge, a ridge she'd seen from the study window for months but hadn't been up. The December cold had broken into one of those strange winter-warm days that occasionally visit the high country, the sky clear and the light at a low angle that made everything look like it had been carefully chosen. The horses moved through frozen grass that crunched underfoot, and she could see the valley spread below them, the whole of it. The creek systems, the pastures, the neighboring operations. The road that ran east through it all toward Morganville and beyond. She could see the Mercer Ranch from up here. The house with the climbing roses she'd pruned back in October, finally. The new barn frame, still raw with fresh lumber. The south pasture, smaller than it had been, but intact. Caleb stopped his horse and reached into his coat and took out an envelope. He held it out to her. She took it. She opened it. It was a land deed. Her name was on it. Eleanor Hayes. A parcel of 40 acres on the North Ridge, including water access to the Upper Creek, registered with the Territorial Land Office. She looked at the document for a long time. "That's not charity," he said, before she could say anything. "That's not a gift. That's what you earned." Gaines calculated what the fraud recovery adds up to, what the ranch would have lost without the documentation you built, what the option contract would have cost us. 40 acres is a conservative accounting of your stake in what happened here. "Caleb, and it's in your name," he said, "not in anyone else's, yours." She held the deed and looked at the valley below her and felt something that she didn't have a clean word for, not happiness exactly, because happiness felt too light for something this complicated. It was more like the feeling of a bone setting correctly after a long time out of place. The rightness of something that should have been true for a long time finally becoming true. She thought about September, about standing in a street in her second-best dress while her father took money from a stranger's hand, about the number 40 and how she'd kept coming back to it and how it had sat inside her like a bruise for months. $40 had been the price of her humiliation. 40 acres was something she had built with her own mind and her own stubbornness and her own refusal to look away from things that were wrong. The arithmetic was not lost on her. "I'm staying," she said. It came out quieter than she intended, which was right. It wasn't a declaration, it was just a fact. "I want to make that clear before you say anything else. I'm staying because this is mine now, and because I built something here, and because—" She stopped. She looked at him. "Because there are people here I don't want to leave." He looked back at her. The low winter light was on his face, and he looked like what he was. A man who had been honest with her from the beginning, and had not been able to make her believe it for a long time, and was now watching her arrive at something he'd been patient enough to wait for. "Okay," he said, "just that." She had expected more and got less, and found that less was exactly right. "The roses are going to need serious work in spring," she said. "I know," he said. "And the south pasture drainage issue Danny and I found, that needs to be addressed before the thaw, or you're going to lose ground cover." "All right." "And the accounts for the first quarter, Eleanor," he said. "What?" "We can go back down," he said. "There's work to do." She looked at the valley one more time, the whole of it, laid out below her in the winter light, imperfect and complicated and full of the specific mess that comes from real things happening to real people over a long time. She thought about what it cost, the kind of life you actually want. Not the cost of getting there, but the ongoing cost of maintaining it, the daily decision to stay, to work, to be honest about what you need and what you're worth. She thought about people who had decided she was worth $40. She thought about what she had decided, about herself. In the end, she put the deed in her coat pocket and turned her horse toward the ranch below. "Let's go," she said. They rode down together through the frozen grass, and the ranch came up to meet them, and the valley held them both inside it, ordinary and flawed and entirely, stubbornly real. That was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough.